After Peter had thrown up in the bathroom, he had left the school as quickly as possible, ignoring Ned's questions as he ran. He couldn't do it. There was no way he was going to get through the rest of the school day feeling like he could throw up again at any minute. All he wanted to do was curl up in a ball and cry. May wouldn't be home, which meant he could wallow in his own self-loathing and heartbreak for a few hours by himself. The moment he reached his apartment, he slammed the door shut. He threw his backpack in front of the door and began stripping out of his clothes, kicking his shoes off. He felt dizzy. He pulled his sweater over his head and dropped it on the ground. He continued to stumble into his bedroom, pulling off his jeans as well and discarding them in the hallway, leaving him in his boxers and socks. He needed to get out of them and into something less suffocating. He knew when May came home and saw his clothes all over the floor that she'd probably worry, as she should, because Peter was far from okay. He pulled out his bottom drawer and pulled out his sweatpants. He wasn't even going to bother putting on a shirt when he noticed, while pulling on his sweatpants, one of your favorite hoodies had occupied the same drawer. It was an oversized maroon hoodie, way too big for you, something Peter used to tease you about. He knew it fit him, and with a shaky hand he pulled it out, immediately burying his nose into the fabric. And upon smelling your scent that lingered so strongly on the hoodie, he let out his first real sob since the breakup, and collapsed onto his knees. The cry was loud and broken, muffled by the hoodie. He clutched it to his face, tightly, and finally started crying. He pulled it away from his face and pulled it on, your scent enveloping him. He pulled up the hood and stumbled back onto his feet, making his way to his bed. He fell onto his bed, tears running down his cheeks as ugly sobs ripped through his throat. And once again, he noticed something else that was yours. He looked down at the foot of his bed and spotted your pink blanket that you had brought over from your apartment to his, and he pulled it up. He threw the pink blanket over his body and head, now only being consumed by your scent. It comforted him until he realized that the only way he could smell your scent anymore was from it lingering on the belongings you left at his place, and eventually it would fade, or even worse, you'd want them back. It was springtime, too hot to be covered in layers of fabric, but Peter couldn't care less. He buried his face into his pillow and clutched the fabric of your blanket. Now that he was finally settled and by himself, he was really able to feel the weight of the breakup. He cried even harder, wetting the pillow under his head. You were gone. You were really gone. And not only that, you were in the arms of Brad fucking Davis, and he just let it happen. In fact, he just pushed you into spending more and more time with him. Peter treated you like shit, and now he was suffering the consequences. No, he cried into the pillow. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. He sobbed over and over again, hoping that weird haze he's been in these last few months were just a bad dream. She isn't gone. He practically choked on the words, the gravity of the situation hitting him like a truck, and he was having a hard time actually registering that you weren't his anymore. He repeated the last words you said to him in his head. And not for nothing, but you were a fucking awful boyfriend, you prick. And he cried harder. I'm sorry, yes, he cried, muttering your name for the first time since you two broke up. And he laid there, crying to himself, for God knows how long. He bunched up the blanket under his nose, just breathing you in, pretending that everything was fine. Spider-Man be damned. Creans be damned. Peter just wanted to stay here till the end of time, pretending it would be okay, and you were still his girlfriend. And the two of you were still very much in love. And you would come over later that night and marathon the Saw movies he knew you loved but never quite understood why. But he would do it because he was a good boyfriend. You would sit in between his legs. The same pink blanket on top of him now would be wrapped around the both of you, and while you watched the movies, he'd bury his face into your neck because he was never a fan of the gore portrayed in these movies. And he would just breathe in the scent of your perfume and shampoo. He'd look at the profile of your face, now completely distracted from the movie, absolutely mesmerized by you as you chewed on your bottom lip, and his heart would almost burst out of his chest because holy shit, she was so beautiful, and there was nothing I wouldn't do for this girl. And he'd call you princess, because he just loved the way you still got all blushy, even after 3 years of calling you that. and everything would be okay. Because he wasn't that boy who didn't return his girlfriend's phone calls and stood her up on dates. Because he wasn't the same Peter that returned from the blip. The Peter he didn't even recognize now. Because that wasn't him. It was never him. No. Now, Peter was smarter. He was human, and he could feel pain. He felt how much it hurt to lose the girl he was in love with. Now he wasn't the zombie that returned after 5 years in the blip. Now, Peter was awake. May sighed, unlocking the apartment door. It was 5 now, and she already had her usual plan to relax a bit before eventually making dinner. A plate for herself, and a plate for Peter that she'd have to stick in the fridge because he rarely came to dinner anymore. But when she opened the door, it stopped. She furrowed her eyebrows and pushed the door open, seeing Peter's backpack sitting in front of it, and not too far were his shoes thrown haphazardly on the ground. She looked up further ahead and noticed a blue fabric sitting on her floor that she recognized as Peter's Midtown sweater. "Peter?" she called out into the apartment, waiting for an answer, but not receiving any. She shut the door and walked further into the apartment, her footsteps filling the otherwise silent apartment. A sense of dread washed over her as she noticed his jeans laying in a heap in the hallway in front of his bedroom door. Something was very wrong. May walked over quickly to his door and lightly knocked. "Peter?" she said softly, but once again, no response. So with a deep breath, she turned the knob and stepped into his room. Immediately, May noticed your favorite pink blanket stretched over a body, and she knew what this was about. With a heavy heart, she walked over to him, grabbed the edge of the blanket, and pulled it back, revealing exactly what she thought. Peter had fallen asleep, curled up in a ball. He was wearing that same oversized sweatshirt you always wore when you were over, and his fist was balled around the blanket. His eyes were red and swollen, and May could make out the tear stains on his cheeks. She also noticed the damp spots on his pillowcase that were still wet, telling her that he must have just fallen asleep. "Shit," she muttered to herself. Part of her had to admit that she was a little relieved because this was the reaction she had been expecting from him. This was a human reaction. But at the same time, she hated to see her nephew in pain, especially after he's been through so much. She placed the blanket back down, but not back over his head, and let him be. She talked to him when he woke up. For now, she let him sleep. When Peter woke up, it was late. He groaned, blinking away the blurriness from his eyes and rubbing them to get rid of the stickiness from his dried tears. It hadn't even been 5 seconds when Peter remembered everything that happened that day. He let out a whimper, already wanting to cry again, pulling the blanket back over his head. May was surely home at this time, but Peter couldn't find the will to search for his aunt. He felt and heard a vibration right by his head, reminding him that he had placed his phone by his pillow when he came in earlier. With shaky hands, he reached for his phone and turned it on, the light from the screen illuminating the dark room. He took note of how it was already 11, and he was thankful that it was a Friday. He unlocked his phone and went to his texts. Seeing how he had 15 missed texts from Ned and 4 missed texts from MJ, he was about to turn it off when he noticed your contact, Princess, with 50 missed texts, and he felt his throat go dry. He realized he had checked his friend's text more often than he had checked his own girlfriend's. He swallowed and nervously pressed her contact, opening the screen to all the missed texts. He scrolled a few times and started reading the messages from a random spot. "Hey, where are you? I've been waiting at Delmar's for half an hour now. Seriously, where are you? I'm getting strange looks." "I left. I guess I'll see you Monday." Peter felt himself getting sick and turned off his phone, placing it back down on the bed. He felt exhausted from crying all day, even after falling asleep, and it just made him think about when you told him you were tired from crying and how you cried with Brad. And once again, Peter felt the never-ending tears spill onto his cheeks again. He pictured you with Brad again from this morning. He remembered how you stood on your tippy toes and kissed him, and how happy he got, and your blushing face smiling brightly up at him. Broken sobs passed his lips, making his chest and upper back constrict in pain, and he buried his blanket against his nose and muffled the sounds. Amidst the violent sobs, he started to remember something. The videos. For the last 4 years of high school, Peter had taken up photography and videoing almost everything he did and everyone he was with, and he always downloaded them onto his computer. There were countless videos of you and him saved onto his computer and laptop. He scrambled up in his bed and pushed the blanket down around his waist. He reached over the side of his bed for the laptop, and he put it down in front of him, opening it up. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up the videos, and he could already see a variety of videos with you as the thumbnail, and reached into his nightstand drawer for his earbuds, fumbling with them as he plugged them into his laptop and stuck the buds into his ears. He quickly clicked the first video, the thumbnail being a Lego Death Star with your head poking out from behind it. Peter bent his knees and wrapped his arms around them as he watched the video begin to play. You and Ned both came into frame, a pile of Legos in front of the two of you, all three of you being in 10th grade at the time. You groaned. "Why do Legos hurt your fingers so much?" you said, shaking out your hand, tired from putting the pieces together. Ned shrugged. "You can take a break if you want." "Nah," you sighed. "It's too much fun. Look at this thing." You held up the piece of the Death Star you had been working on. "I have no idea what this is supposed to be, but it looks so cool," you giggled. You suddenly had noticed the camera as you looked over at Peter. "Peter," you whined out. "Stop doing that all the time." Peter laughed. "I can't help it. You're too pretty not to film." You visibly blushed and shook your head. Ned groaned. "Come on, guys. You promised you wouldn't be all mushy around me." Peter laughed. "I can't help it. We're in love," he sing-songed. A broken laugh, akin to a cry, left Peter's lips as he clicked out of the video. He liked it, of course, but that wasn't one of the ones he had in mind. There were other videos of more intimate moments just between the two of you. He scrolled through the thumbnails of videos when he spotted one he remembered all too well. The cover was of him laying down. What you couldn't see, of course, was the fact you were straddling his lap and holding the camera above him. He quickly clicked the video. "Stop," Peter whined. "Give it back," he said, reaching for the camera. You giggled, holding it up higher. "No, you video me all the time. I'm just returning the favor." Your hand came into view, pressing down on his chest so he was laying flat against the bed. Peter rolled his eyes, but complied. "Fine. What's the video about then?" he asked teasingly. You hummed. How about how pretty my boyfriend is?" He rolled his eyes. "I'm not pretty." You gasped in fake offense. "Yes, you are. You're the prettiest boyfriend ever." You giggled. "You're my pretty boy." Peter laughed. "You're what?" "My pretty boy." You chirped again. You moved up, straddling his waist now. You got pretty brown hair. You hummed, your hand raking through his brown curls. "And pretty eyes." Your finger trailed down his forehead and around his eyes. "And the cutest crooked nose." Your finger chased the bridge of his nose. "And such pretty lips. Even if they are thin." You laughed, making Peter roll his eyes. "You're prettier, though," he said, and you shook your head. "Nuh-uh. You're the prettiest." "Okay, how about this? I'll be your pretty boy if you agree that you're my pretty girl." You hummed again. "All right, I guess I can live with that." "Good, 'cause I think you have much prettier lips than me." And in a flash, Peter pulled the camera out of your hand, pointing it towards the two of you as he leaned up and pulled you down for a kiss. Peter watched as the two of you kissed on screen until the video cut off. The sob he was holding back tore free from his throat, and he buried his face into his arms and knees, muffling his cries. Pretty boy. That had been your nickname for him. He always pretended that it had ignored him, but deep down he loved it. Peter couldn't remember the last time he heard you call him that, and it made his heart clench. He would do anything if he got to hear you call him pretty boy again. He stayed like that, head buried in his knees for a few minutes before he decided to torment himself by watching another video. This time, he clicked on the thumbnail of your sleeping face. He remembered taking this about a year ago. You were sick that day, and Peter had come over to comfort you and keep you company until you got better. At one point, he left to the drugstore to pick up some things for you, and when he got back, you were passed out on the bed. In seconds, Peter had his camera out and began recording you. A ruffling noise sounded as Peter turned on the camera and sunk onto his knees, your peaceful face coming into frame. Peter sighed from behind the camera, his hand coming into view as he pushed back a strand of your hair from your face. "How are you still the prettiest girl in the world, even when you're sick?" he asked from behind the camera. "I don't know if you'll ever see this video, but if you do, I promise I'm not being creepy. I saw you looking so peaceful, which is nice because you've been coughing all day, and I hate seeing my princess so miserable. But you look so calm right now, and I really need you to get better because you have no idea how badly I want to kiss you." Peter sighed again in content. "I love you, you know? Like, I love you so much, it physically hurts. I think about you all the time, especially when I'm out as Spider-Man." "That's good to know, because I think about you when you're out as Spider-Man too," you nasally mumbled, eyes still closed shut. Peter groaned. "How much of that did you hear?" "The part where you said you loved me," you teased, fluttering your eyes open. "Well, it's true." "Good. Because I love you too, pretty boy. Peter groaned again. Are you ever gonna drop the pretty boy thing? Of course not. It's your new nickname and you can't argue with me because I'm sick. Peter laughed. Oh, so you're gonna pull out the sick card, huh? You nodded. Yes. Now come nap with me, pretty boy. I need my big spoon. Alright, but I better not get sick, Peter said, turning off the camera. Peter scrolled through the video some more, blinking away the blurriness from his tears. He stopped upon finding a video without a thumbnail. It was just a black screen, and he immediately remembered it. Recording it was an accident. You were over one night and May was out. The two of you were trying to get homework done, and Peter started fiddling with his camera, looking for the photos he took for his photography class. At one point, you started getting antsy, and one thing led to another, and things started to get heated between the two of you. Nothing crazy, you just made out. However, when you pulled the camera out of his hands, you accidentally hit record without realizing it, and the camera recorded the whole makeout session. And Peter realized that this was the last time the two of you actually kissed. This was only a few days before Thanos, and after the blip, nothing was the same between you two. After the blip, when Peter had been mourning the loss of Tony Stark, when Peter spent a lot more of his time as Spider-Man, and he started pushing you away. His hands shook as he clicked the video, his ears being filled with a ruffling sound, the frame shaking as you pulled it out of his hands and placed it on his desk. You climbed onto Peter's lap. Princess, he whined. You know I have a lot of work to do. You hummed as you began kissing his neck. I know, pretty boy. Peter's head tilted back, giving you more room. I just want to kiss for a little bit. I'll leave you alone after. Your voice was hushed. He sighed. Alright. And with that, your lips met his in a rehearsed dance. Peter buried his face into his knees again, peeking out from behind him, watching the scene as your lips locked together, and all he could hear were the soft little hums from you. All that went through his head was how that would no longer be you and him anymore. Now, it would be you and Brad. And he felt sick to his stomach. Much like when he saw the two of you earlier together that day. He couldn't stop himself as the thoughts made their way into his brain that he'd never get to hold you again. Never share those sweet, intimate moments with you again. He wouldn't even be able to build Legos with you anymore. But Brad could do all those things, and judging by what he saw, he already started to. It fucking broke Peter. The thought of you with anyone other than himself. Actually having seen it with his own two eyes, the whole thing just seemed like a twisted nightmare. You were his. You were always his girl. Even when the two of you were in elementary school, he'd follow you around everywhere you went, and in middle school when Flash tried to bully you, he stood up for you in a way he was never able to stand up for himself when he was the one being bullied. You were his even when he was just this scrawny nerd that everyone picked on, and you were still his when he became Spider-Man. But now, you were Brad's, and it made him physically sick. Peter shut his laptop, the room being flooded in darkness once again, and he continued to cry into his knees. Not a minute later, Peter heard 3 knocks on his bedroom door, and May said softly, Peter? He looked up and glanced at the time, seeing that it was already past midnight, and he probably woke up his aunt. Peter? She asked again, this time pushing the door open, the light from the hallway spilling into his room. She could just make out his form sitting up, and she felt the side of his wall for the light switch and flicked it up. A deep frown settled on her face as she spotted her nephew, completely heartbroken as he looked back at her. His eyes were even more red and swollen since the last time she saw him, and his nose was red as well too. There were dark spots on the hoodie he wore and the blanket on his lap from the tears. Oh, Pete, she sighed. Do you want to talk about it? She offered. Peter let out a choked sob. I was a bad boyfriend, he wailed, and larger tears started running down his face faster. May quickly made her way over to him and sat down, pulling him into her, and the two sat there as Peter cried into her, as she did her best to calm him down, rubbing his back and muttering comforting words. It's all my fault. I hurt her. May, he choked out the words. May stayed silent, letting him work through how he felt on his own for a bit. I love her, May. I love her so much. I do. I promise I do. He repeated the words, trying to take back the fact that during lunch, he actually said he didn't love you anymore. And what was worse was that he actually believed it too. As if Peter Parker could ever fall out of love with Yasmin. I know, sweetheart, May hummed, trying her best to soothe the crying boy, running a hand through his curls. He shook in her arms, and I was so horrible to her. I made her cry. I made Yasmin cry, and he couldn't get the words out. The same way when a child cried, they kept choking on their words because they couldn't get a full breath in. May continued to run a comforting hand down his back. Shh. She hushed. She had never seen Peter this hysterical before, and it was pushing her far out of her comfort zone. And now, she's with someone else. May's eyes widened, not knowing that bit of information. What do you mean she's with someone else? She asked worriedly. I saw her and Brad today, and he asked her out, and she said yes. And if possible, he cried even harder, holding on to her tightly. And she kissed him. Yes, kissed another boy. Her eyebrows furrowed, her heart plummeting into her chest. She was hoping that he'd realize his mistake before this exact situation happened. May knew what it was like to be in love. How to love someone so much that being without them felt like a piece of you died, like you weren't complete without them. But at least in Peter's case, you were still here. And as long as you were here, Peter still had a chance to make it right. May knew that you must have still felt something for Peter. You had to. The two of you were basically attached at the hip since you were both 5. Peter, May said firmly, pulling back. She cupped his chin to look up at her. I need you to calm down for a bit, okay? He nodded, but the tears kept falling and he kept shaking. He buried his head back into his knees and cried harder than ever. May frowned, running her hand through his curls to help him calm down. She almost felt herself getting broken up by the scene, but she knew she needed to be strong for him. Do you love her, Peter? His head snapped up as he nodded frantically. Yes, I love her so much. Then why did you hurt her? She asked. She had to know. That single question had been weighing on her since she first noticed the distance he put between the two of you. I don't know, he cried. The blip and Mr. Stark and the Avengers, I don't know. I just pushed her away. May always had the feeling that it had to do with everything that happened only months ago, but she could never be sure since other than the extra time he spent patrolling, he seemed to be getting along just fine. Do you want to talk about that? Peter shook his head. I don't know what to say. His brain was swimming, and for months he had been having trouble figuring out how he felt, and now with the breakup, he really felt like he was losing it. I really wish I could tell you what to do to fix this, Peter. But with the things you said to her when you two broke up, she said sadly, I do think you should at least apologize to her. I don't know if I can. She hates me. He whispered the last part because it felt so unreal to say that now. Can you at least try to make it right? Peter simply nodded and thought, wiping away the tears on his cheek, which proved to be useless as they were replaced by fresh ones seconds later. However, he was able to stop shaking as violently as before. May sighed again. Is there anything I can get you? Tea, maybe? He shook his head. No, I think I just need to be alone. She nodded. All right. We were supposed to go upstate and visit Claire and her new baby, but I don't think you're going to be up for it. So I'll be gone for most of the day. Will you be okay on your own tomorrow? Peter just nodded. Okay, she said softly, biting her lip as she stood up. Good night, then. Try to get some sleep. If you need me, don't be afraid to wake me up. He nodded again. Okay, he muttered. May left, turning off the light and closing the door behind her. Peter moved his laptop to his nightstand and curled back up in his spot. The pink blanket wrapped around him and bunched up under his nose again. He tried to sleep. He really did. But now he was lost in his own head. He thought back on these past few months as he finally realized how upset and miserable you had been, and he couldn't believe he was the one to actually cause it and how blind he had been to it. He thought back to each of your attempts at getting him to talk to you and how he just brushed you off. That night where he muted you, feeling disgusted by his actions now, and he wondered if you had cried that night too. He also remembered all the one-sided conversations between the two of you and how you would fall into one of your rants just to realize he wasn't listening. And he couldn't even imagine how that made you feel because Peter always listened. He thought about everything that he did to you and how fucked up it was now. And Peter had lots of regrets in his life, but this one was definitely one of the worst. Peter thought about the night you spent with Brad the day before you broke up with him. He wondered what the two of you did. If you did the same things you did with Brad that you did with him.
And he wondered how he comforted you when you cried, if you buried your face in his neck and wrapped your arms around him in the same way you did with Peter when he was the one to comfort you. He felt jealously bubble in his stomach at the thought of Brad. Brad, the guy who could have any girl he wanted, but he went after Peter's. But at the same time, would he have even realized how in love with you he still was if it wasn't for Brad? Peter didn't want to think about what would have happened then. He thought back on the breakup, feeling disgusted with himself that he accused you of cheating. He remembered how you said you weren't happy being his girlfriend anymore. He remembered you telling him that you still wanted to be friends and how he completely ruined that, probably pushing you further into Brad's arms. And he thought about having to see you with Brad again when he went back to school. Seeing you holding his hand or kissing his cheek, it all just made him want to set himself on fire. And as for Spider-Man and Queens, they just have to wait. Even Spider-Man had to take some days off for himself. But now, he was alone in his bed crying to the point that it was painful, wrapped up in his ex-girlfriend's hoodie and blanket because they were now the few things he had left of her, as he experienced having his heart broken for the very first time. It was a very long and sleepless night.